So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of NIS2, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and some of the legislative changes that are coming in the cybersecurity world. I'm Tom Venables. I'm the Enterprise Solutions Director for Turnkey Consulting, which means I pull together our service offerings across integrated risk management, identity and access governance, and the cyber and application security practice. I'm pleased today to be joined by Philip Byro, one of our senior managers in the cybersecurity space, who's expert insight I'm looking forward to hearing on the NIS2 piece especially. So thanks, Philip.
Looking forward to the discussion. Hello, everyone.
So we're going to do a brief rundown of some of the new legislation that we've seen coming, why this change is happening, some of the steps that organizations should be taking to prepare, and some of the principles that are outlined. We will be fielding questions, and there is a guide that we'll be publishing for NIS2 especially, that everybody who's attending and has registered will gain access to. So without further ado, why are we talking about legislative changes now? There's been a raft of them. There's been a whole host of new legislation introduced, and it's in response to a clearly growing threat. Since the pandemic, we've seen a rise in ransomware. We've seen malware as a service massively expand. You've probably seen that people are concerned about the use of AI in creating new vulnerabilities. And it's largely attacking not just corporate clients and financial fraud and misstatements, but some critical national infrastructure attacks as well, as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline, where several million Americans lost access to gas because of one unsecured admin password. We also have seen things like the SolarWinds and Log4j vulnerabilities, which those were particularly concerning because they started to be vulnerabilities in the systems that we rely on to spot vulnerabilities themselves. And the Latitude financial data breach, one of the largest in Australia recently, fairly publicly not paying the ransom on that one. So the threat is growing, and governments around the world are no longer seeing that recommendations are strong enough. They're starting to actually understand that there is a need for legislation and regulation to drive good practice in the security space. So I wanted to provide a quick overview of what we've seen in sort of like the last year and what we're seeing coming up this year. In Canada, we've got a critical Cybersecurity Protection Act for critical infrastructure. There's the new National Cybersecurity Strategy in the US, coupled with some SEC and FTC regulations. Obviously, NIS2. There's an IT crimes law, which I think is in the United Arab Emirates now. South Africa has a new national cybersecurity policy framework. There's a new office being set up in Australia as well. And I've grouped some data privacy changes as well in here, not because the legislation is necessarily the same. Obviously, there's differences and nuance, but because the impact to our customers and to organizations generally is very, very similar. You're still looking at data level security. You're still looking at transmission and storage and processing and application security, and a lot of the same protections that you have to apply and the hoops that you've got to jump through, if you want to call them that, are going to be incumbent on organizations. So although they're slightly different in their context, their content can often be very, very similar. And something to call out as well, we actually have a little bit of a model for this. When GDPR landed in the EU as a data privacy sort of standard, we've seen that minimum baseline that was laid out in GDPR has started to be adopted a little bit more globally. Australia and New Zealand, for example, are very closely aligning their approaches with what's enumerated in the GDPR. And I think a similar thing may well happen with NIS2. It may become a template that gets adopted globally. The reason we're going to focus on it more in this session is simply that they've published more details about it. So the NCS in North America, for example, is pretty light on detail. It's enumerated some practices and it is going to make changes, but it hasn't yet been too clear on how those are going to be implemented. But Philip, I think they're probably going to be similar to what we see in Europe, right?
It's very likely, as you say, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in detail as well going forward. But what has been pretty much defined in NIS2, and actually two other directives as well that I want to very quickly just touch upon that are happening pretty much at the same time with NIS2, which one of them is the CER, the Critical Entities Resilience Act, and the DORA Act. Well, technically it's the DOR Act because the Act is the A. But all three are pretty much happening at the same time, focusing at different parts of both technical, process relevant, infrastructure resilience, and general security, be it cybersecurity or personal. So just a quick few words I would just share about CER and DORA before we jump into the NIST details, because that's the meat of what we want to talk about. So you could consider the CER or RCE, whichever you want to call it, to be the policy backbone of most security regulations going forward in Europe. It replaces the ECI, the European Critical Infrastructures, which was in place since 2008. And it will pretty much focus on any risk management, resilience around physical, personal security, operational redundancy, business continuity on any services that are considered critical on a European level. These are defined. We'll talk about defined sectors and details on that later. And there are some interesting things. Disruption effects need to be calculated in these sectors and in the affected infrastructures, and based on that, very detailed reporting will need to be done. So that's for the CER. NIS2 very specifically focuses on the cybersecurity aspects of it, which we will be talking about in detail. And DORA is very, very specifically aimed at the financial sector, focusing on a lot of updates that are happening and new threats coming through new technology in the fintech sector, and basically making sure that all of those effects are handled appropriately.
Thanks for that. And yeah, I think we're certainly seeing those sort of financial sector pieces mirrored on the other side of the pond with the SEC and FTC regulations. Correct. That have been tightened up as well. So I wanted to call out that there's two pieces that rhyme, which can make discussing these quite confusing. We obviously have NIS2, which is an update to the previous NIS regulatory framework, but there is also NIST 2.0. Which is an update to the cybersecurity framework. Everybody who's listening to us at the moment hopefully should be somewhat familiar with NIST as a cybersecurity framework, but they are updating some of the minimum standards in the sort of 853 controls, etc., and some of the pieces that are considered good practice. So I do recommend that people go and check that out. But that's not what we're focusing on this session. Here we're talking about the legislation itself. So, Philip, what's changing? What do we need to highlight?
All right, so NIS2 is looking to pretty much harmonize all security, the minimum security requirements toward critical infrastructure in the entirety of the European Union. Why am I saying minimum? And this is, I want to point this out very, very specifically at the beginning of this discussion, that NIS2, the Network and Infrastructure Security Act or directive, it is focused on defining the EU minimum, the required minimum. This means that what we're going to talk about today does not mean that that will be all that all the nations will adopt in the end, but that will be the defined minimum that needs to be adopted in all of the nations of the EU. A good example of this, for example, is Germany, one of my personal areas that I am active in, which has the BSI, which is the actual legal authority behind security solutions and legislation in Germany, and they have a so-called KRITIS, KRITIS, directive, which does cover a lot, actually, that is now being set as the minimum by NIS2. So
Yeah.
there will be big differences by what needs to be in the end and what will be actually implemented in certain nations and certain countries, because the baseline is different.
Yeah.
So just wanted to point that out, that many things that are on the list of NIS2, of NIS2, may have already been implemented in some countries. So the delta definitely needs to be covered. And of course, anything above that is always happily welcomed by anybody.
Yeah, and we saw that with GDPR, right? There was a minimum standard outlined, but some local implementations of that go above and beyond those minimums. I think one of the key things that changes, as it did with GDPR, is that these sanctions and penalties are more clearly enumerated now. And
correct. So, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, you go on.
Right. So when it comes to the sanctions and penalties, up until this point, there were sanctions and penalties defined, but they're very, very vaguely defined. Mm-hmm. In a situation of actual sanctions being brought to any kind of organization or infrastructure or provider, it would depend a lot on, let's say, situational awareness and what exactly happened to define the actual sanctions. This changes very, very clearly now. NIS2 defines a level of criticality very clearly. There are technically two levels of criticality. Don't want to go into the details there because the definition of them is a little bit chaotic. But the point is that those different levels of criticality are very, very clearly defined with sanctions as well. So basically, if this happens at this criticality, you know what the minimum sanction is. And here I want to point back to the point that I made earlier. These are the minimum sanctions that the EU is requiring. We know for a fact that in Germany, for example, you will have higher sanctions. Germany is currently working on the Cybersecurity Act 3.0. Most of these NIS2 and relevant regulations will probably be built into that. And it will probably be, the first draft will be available in a couple of months, probably Q3, Q4 of 2023 to see. And we know for a fact that some of the penalties will be higher than what NIS2, so the European Union, defined as well. We can see here two examples of dependent on the size of the organization. Basically, it's dependent on either global revenue of the organization that had the security breach, a certain percentage of it, or 7 or 10 million euros per breach, depending on which one is higher. It's always the higher one. Big companies, 2% can probably hurt more than just a 10 million.
Definitely. And I think one of the things you highlighted there is it's not just these essential industries, but there is a shared accountability model now where, you know, if I'm working in the energy sector and I've got an outsourced third-party supplier, I share the accountability with that supplier. So they may not be in the energy sector, but all of a sudden they're brought into scope, right?
That is very correct. And if you jump ahead 1 second, just to quickly look at the sectors as well. So obviously, a lot of these are, even at the first look, things that humanity requires at the bottom of the Maslow pyramid, right? Yeah. So what you need for life, it's you need electricity, you need to be able to get from A to B, you need health, when anything for health relevant reasons, water, food, those kinds of things, obviously. Now, what are interesting adjustments to this, and to your point of the whole supply chain being now regulated under NIS2, is, for example, if you are not even a very big provider of, as you say, service management, ICT service management, let's say you are one of the companies that manages the servers which have some kind of relation to the water supply. It can be as minimal as literally one person sitting there next to a server and sometimes taking a look at it. But as soon as that server provides any kind of service, data, or any kind of communication for that water supplier or energy supplier or any kind of large critical infrastructure relevant company, you immediately become critical infrastructure yourself.
Yep.
And depending on what kind of critical infrastructure you are supporting with your services, you potentially become critical infrastructure completely irrelevant of the size of your company.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are, of course, in NIS2 defined sizes for large size, medium size companies. The basis of the sizing is that anybody who does not reach a medium size would not be handled under the European security directives. However, and here's the big however that we just mentioned, if you're whatever size, if you're just literally alone sitting in your mother's basement, but you support any of these companies, you immediately become relevant and critical infrastructure according to the NIS directive.
Yeah, if you're providing those critical services. So,
yes.
If you're keeping the servers online, then you're probably very important to their business, right?
Exactly.
And I think, just to focus on one of the other main sort of changes that I see on here is the focus on the sort of, obviously we always talk about people, process, and technology. There's a lot more emphasis being placed on those processes for breach notification, reporting, and instant handling, right?
Absolutely. It's been actually very surprisingly well defined what needs to be reported and what doesn't need to be reported, and not just from the simple perspective of anything happens, you need to report it, but it's actually properly defined what the requirements are to identify a critical breach, a non-critical breach, and different levels. And it's been very clearly defined what needs to be and in what way reported. What is very interesting as well, that how this reporting process is going to happen is definitely going to be defined by your nation-specific legislative entities. However, what NIS2 very definitely says is that all breaches that adhere to any of the criticalities that are defined by NIS2 will need to be reported to the European Council. They need to go through NISA, the Network and Infrastructure Security Agency of the European Union. This obviously pointing towards wanting the proper visibility to be able to provide the harmonization effort globally, or at least on the level of the European Union.
Yeah, and that's really, I mean, it's helpful guidance, and I like that this is, public domain. So anybody who's watching us and listening right now can go and check out what those reporting guidelines are, what some of the minimum standards are. I think it's also worth, I know we're not talking about NIST too closely, but some of the changes that are coming in those cybersecurity frameworks are around very similar things. They've expanded the industry applicability of the cybersecurity framework. They've updated some of the guidance for the implementation, the governance, the risk management, the processes that have to be in place. And they're also highlighting supply chain risk management. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of alignment between what we see on the sort of blue team side, if you like, and the regulatory changes to push that.
Just one very quick point back, to the reporting aspect of the whole directive, is that it has now been defined that regular reviews need to happen. The regularity of the reviews has only been set to 4 years, but I know, for example, that it will be much more often in certain countries. Again, example, Germany, at least every 2 years for every critical infrastructure. And what is very interesting and that is a very new thing, and we will see how exactly that will play out. But the European Union is planning, in contribution with ENISA, cross-country risk assessments across entireties of supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
So especially if you're a representative of a company that does have international supply chains, which, let's be honest, most of them are currently.
Yeah.
You can expect ENISA to knock on your door and basically be like, all right, in the next couple of months, we will be doing a very detailed penetration test of the security of your entire supply chain.
Yeah, and a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? And
that is correct.
As a small provider ourselves, we're definitely gearing up to be more robust and demonstrate these controls. I think that international piece actually brings us on to some of the changes worldwide. We're seeing an increased focus on collaboration internationally in every piece of legislation I've reviewed. There is always a line or a pillar that says we're going to cooperate internationally to disrupt and dismantle threat actors, is usually the line that they use. And in the Americas, we've mentioned the National Cybersecurity Strategy published in March by the White House. It's shifting the focus and the onus, if you like, for securing infrastructure back onto organizations. And it is talking about that supply chain piece. Where are you getting your chips from? How can you guarantee that there aren't 0 days or vulnerabilities in your software supply chain as well as your hardware supply chain? As well as that managed service element, those service providers, your ISPs, your hosting partner, your security service provider, the people who do your password resets out of a call center somewhere in the world. All of those seem to be being brought into scope. There's a focus on DevSecOps, for example, in the software development lifecycle, and more robust security controls around application development. And it's trying to make the public and private sectors work together. So I saw a brilliant summary that said it's not the NSA's problem to secure US companies anymore. It's their problem. It's a shared accountability model again. The SEC and FTC have also been publishing some updated cybersecurity guidance for heavily regulated financial services sector, et cetera, market trading especially. Which are tying accountability back to these organizations, that they've got to have these processes. They have to be conducting regular risk assessments and reviewing them. An interesting one was that they must appoint a CISO, or by default, the CEO is considered liable, which I thought was quite an interesting, statement to say you are accountable here. And again, a focus on third-party risk management. And that trend continues with the Canadian CCSPA, the Critical Cyber Systems Protection Act, which is a bit of a mouthful. But again, looking at critical infrastructure, looking at suppliers to that, increased rigor around reporting requirements, breach notifications, collaboration. And the statement at the sort of federal government level is that they're going to compel behavior on the part of these organizations, which I read as very similar to NIS2, that we're going to start talking sanctions. They're going to start using the stick.
Absolutely, and what very important or very interesting information that I just read a couple of days ago. The ENISA actually published their yearly risk assessment and cyber threat assessment for 2022 in detail. And interestingly enough, what we're seeing is that the cyber threats that are happening and actual threat attacks that are happening, more than 3/4 of all of the attacks that have been reported, obviously, in the EU, are happening against basically technically four areas of businesses. One, obviously, the biggest one is public administration and government with 24%.
Mm-hmm.
But the second is service providers, and half of all those, specifically digital service providers, which 13% of all cyber attacks are currently going against digital service providers, not against directly the energy suppliers or water suppliers or anything, but the little middleman that can be reached and has the architecture and the infrastructure that can be attacked, and that is frightening, actually, and that is a very big increase. Interestingly enough, number of reported attacks in the EU actually decreased since 2021. Interestingly enough, however, all of the attacks were pretty much pushed towards different sectors. And the attacks towards digital services and services in general have increased almost twofold since 2021.
And from the attacker's point of view, that makes sense, right? Because why attack this multi-billion-dollar corporation that's spending, billions on their cyber defense and their firewalls and their protections, if you can get into a small service provider who doesn't have that sort of cybersecurity budget? And we see the same sort of thing repeated worldwide, right? The EU we get pretty good data from, but the same is true for the rest of the world. And that's why we're seeing changes in Australia with their new National Office for Cybersecurity that apparently has a focus on legislative changes. In Asia Pacific, there's a lot of focus on data privacy because there's a lot of data handling going through companies based there, and so they've needed to tighten up. We've seen new privacy laws being touted for India and Vietnam, slated to be released this year. And I also wanted to call out just a market force. This isn't a legislative change, but actually cyber insurance, which we see some organizations using as a bit of a mitigating control against some of their cyber risk. They've just completed a couple of years of paying out an awful lot of claims, over 80% in some parts of the world. And they're now tightening their belts. They are being much more prescriptive around what is and isn't covered. We saw Lloyd's of London will not underwrite nation state attacks, for example. That was published a couple of months ago. What is a nation state attack these days? If I can go onto GitHub and download something that was developed by a Russian hacking group and post it on there, is somebody going to try and argue that I've used a nation state exploit, even though all I've done is buy it with a credit card? It's going to be interesting, but it is driving better behavior and better robust controls in the cybersecurity space, but just a free market impact.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And from what I'm seeing and what the numbers say as well is that even the why policies are necessary is the point that I want to get through. Is because policies give the basis to everything, even the technical security and even the awareness of the end user. Why is that relevant? Same report from NIS2 on the findings is that basically there are two types of attacks that have been happening 80% of the time. One of them are distributed denial of service attacks, and the other one are ransomware attacks. And the interesting, and then in the report itself, it is mentioned that there are surprisingly low amount of attacks against end users directly, so social engineering and those things of the kind.
Yeah.
But what then the report itself mentions is that the biggest amount of attacks were mainly ransomware attacks, and 95% of those ransomware attacks had social engineering parts to them. Yeah. So the categorization is kind of off-shot a little bit, but the point is, unless those policies, procedures, guidances, and that actual visibility and awareness of the topics and requirements is there, these ransomware attacks, for example, these would just keep happening. And these, through the social engineering access that is so easy, it is really easy to receive accesses to systems through social engineering, and obviously later then use them as the basis for ransomware. Without those policies and without those stricter policies that we are talking about right now, for example, with NIS2, the future can be pretty bleak, especially now that what we're seeing, how genius ways have been created for social engineering through AI generated images, deepfakes, voice modulators.
Yeah.
It's not even just sending an email. You can literally call someone with the name of someone else, with the voice of someone else, to ask them to do things.
Yeah.
So it's scary, and the awareness needs to be there.
Yeah, and I think that is something that people hear cybersecurity and they often think, oh, that's a techies problem. That's about stopping hackers and it's about coding, right? It's not. The vast majority of it is about culture and behavior. If we can improve that, then we can stop an awful lot of attacks before they start. Yes, we need to harden our systems. Yes, we need effective vulnerability management and network protections and everything else that goes into a cyber defense. But the people and process piece is, I think, often outweighs the technology piece, because a lot of those vulnerabilities are introduced by the people, which brings us on to how people can start to prepare for an NIS2 compliance. And I think we have yep. I know we're running short on time, so we will whistle through this. But the first thing that I think a customer should be doing is assessing where they stand on their cyber defense posture. Now, they can use NIST CSF, or other competing standards are available. There's good guidance from CISA. There's good guidance from a number of organizations out there. But at the very least, NIS2 actually gives the guidance on these 10 areas. So how do you handle your risk analysis? Do you do a business impact assessment? Do you assess the data that is used, transmitted, stored by your critical business processes? And what do you do with that data? Do you have the ability to handle an incident? If a breach occurs, can you respond and recover to an incident quickly? Have you got the processes in place to notify the regulators these days because of the changes that are coming there? Yeah. And do you have the business continuity plans in place to pick up should the worst occur? If somebody encrypts a critical database that's used by your ERP system, for example, then can you quickly back up and recover from that without impacting your production line or your logistics supply chain, or your upstream or downstream services? Do you assess your supply chain? So do you understand the relationships on that entity? I mean, Philip spoke about it earlier. The small suppliers are going to be within the scope of that supply chain if they're providing critical services to you. And if you don't do that third-party risk assessment, how are you going to? What are your policies in place to do that? And how are you going to enforce those standards on your third parties? Your network and information system acquisition security. Are you doing your diligence that every application that you use is secure? How are you proving that? How are you testing that? Do you conduct regular testing? We talked about the policies and procedures piece, and I think the cybersecurity training piece is spoken to in the human element that we just spoke about. Obviously, cryptography and encryption is an important piece. A simple example that everybody will be familiar with is password length. Standard 8-character password with one number, one special character, one capital letter, which is pretty ubiquitous still. Somebody with a decent machine with a graphics processor on it can crack that in about 8 hours. They don't need a supercomputer anymore. The processing power is such that they can brute force simple passwords. You should be using multi-factor authentication encryption, wherever possible.
Or completely passwordless approaches. Yeah. And I think we will talk about that a little bit later as well.
Yeah. Human resources security, access control policies, and asset management. It starts with understanding who your users are, who should have access to your assets. And a big part of that is who works for you. But you can allocate those assets as part of those human resources processes. And I think it's interesting that this one's called out, because I think HR play a bigger factor in securing an organization than they necessarily might think they do. I think the CISO would love to have slightly more robust processes around how we allocate assets and access to people based on HR triggers and HR information. And then, as we said, the use of multi-factor authentication, continuous authentication. This is about a zero trust approach. Who is coming into my systems? Who is accessing my data? How do I validate every step of that interaction, that digital transaction, if you like, that the person coming in is who I think it is, that they're coming from a secure connection, and that they're not, coming in with malicious intent. And that's about a zero trust approach. And zero trust is one of these sort of architectural principles that we hear a lot about. We don't often think about it as necessarily applying to applications like SAP, which is where my background is, but actually it's an architectural approach that should be taken across your entire environment. And CISA provide some really good guidance. The two diagrams that you can see here are both lifted straight from CISA, so credit to them. But verifying the identity of who's accessing, verifying the security of the devices that they're accessing from, and the network and environment that they're coming from as well and into. That's all about conditional access policies. We no longer need to rely on just a username and password to secure data. We can now say not only who are you, but are you on McDonald's Wi-Fi, where anybody could be sniffing what's coming out the air? Are you on a cellular network? We can actually these days put conditional access policies in that secure those far better. Application workload is an important one. We've highlighted a couple of times the importance of DevSecOps and understanding your software supply chain. So making sure that your applications are secure. That might be internally developed ones. It may be ones that you procure off the shelf, but you still have to do your diligence. You have to prove that you've done that. And then finally, intelligently limiting access to data. So once somebody is authenticated, what should they be able to do? And again, does that change on various different access policies? But I did want to highlight that this is all a maturity curve. You don't need to tomorrow be at the top of the optimal side of the maturity curve here. At the very least, you should have these traditional pieces in place. And if you haven't, that's your gap analysis. Start to fix that, and then start to look at what your journey from now to good to great looks like. That's the most important thing to take away from this, I think, is that your journey to a more secure environment is a journey. It's not something that you just switch on. It's not based on technology. As Philip highlighted, there's a lot of human elements to this, a lot of process pieces where organizational change is key. Philip, anything to add on that?
There's one thing that I want to highlight here is that obviously this is something to strive for. And as you mentioned, you're not going to be at the completely optimal situation at the end of the whole process. But what I've seen in my experience and some customers as well is that there's a bit of a disconnect between the implementation of suggested activities, security steps, for example, like having multi-factor authentication, those kinds of things for the identity validation and access management. You need to be aware that, yes, these are useful, but if you want to have actual security resilience, you need to have multiple things in place. For example, you can have the best cutting edge identity management and access management that money can buy and service provider can implement. But if you don't have a network communication that is properly encrypted end to end, you are prone to man-in-the-middle attacks, basically, that completely nullify all the money and all the effort that you invested into your identity management. So it's very important to find the ideal middle ground that covers everything for you and then improve from that point on.
Yeah, establish a baseline, make sure it's integrated. and then move up from there and bring the whole bar up rather than just like trying to, like the old graphic equalizers you used to see on stereos if you're as old as me.
Yes.
So I think we're coming to the end now, but a few conclusive or conclusionary thoughts. I think legislation is good for us as security professionals overall, because I think raising the bar is important. I think collaborating, as a lot of these do, is important to target the threat. I think it may actually unlock some funding for stuff that we've wanted to do for a while. So, good practice costs, and justifying that cost is not always that easy when you go up to your senior stakeholders. Hopefully, a little bit more of a focus on legislative compliance might help unlock some funding for what we know to be good practice. Third-party risk management is a key focus for this. Whether you are a third party yourself or whether you're responsible for assessing them, it's going to be something that moves front and center in a lot of these legislative changes. Obviously, focus on the people, the processes, and the technology. As Philip just mentioned, there is no silver bullet. There's no one solution that you can switch on and be secure. It's a journey that requires a lot of integration. The key thing is to start somewhere, and you will identify your gaps, and you'll close those, and you'll move on. I think one key thing to highlight as well is, although legislation may drive investment, it shouldn't be treated as just a minimum standard. It shouldn't be, okay, so we've got this policy in place, so we're good. There is a tendency for compliance to be treated as a little bit of a checkbox exercise if you're not careful. And I do think, don't just be compliant. Think about where your risk sits, and as a lot of the local implementations of NIS2, for example, will be, try and exceed that minimum standard where you can, because this doesn't sit still. The threat has evolved massively over the last 20 years. That evolution is accelerating as technology continues to improve and techniques change. And I think, start with an assessment of your current state. Make sure you're ready. I'm already seeing customers that all of their new products or projects, need to be NIS2 compliant. So these changes will be coming within your organization if they haven't already. As I mentioned, we will be publishing a guide to everybody that's attending, which is just a slightly more in-depth sort of white paper guide to navigate in NIS2. It goes into a little bit more detail on some of these points as a reference for you. You can contact Philip or myself if you have any questions, so feel free.